Welcome everyone. Thanks for attending another Magnolia webinar. Today we're doing a webinar on app development, and we're covering slightly more advanced topics than the last app development webinar that we did. We've got three presenters today, all from our core Magnolia team. We have Andreas Vader, who heads up user experience at Magnolia. When you use the Magnolia 5 shell, you're using work that Andreas led. So he knows the system very well, designed a lot of the interaction patterns, and is a great resource for us today. We have Jan Herderka, who's a longtime Magnolia staffer. Jan has done most things at Magnolia and knows the system backwards and forwards, from implementation details to how customers use it in the wild. We're also joined by Mikhail Geliuk, who's a software engineer. He focuses on the user interface and brings deep experience of Magnolia app development with him. We're going to start by having Andreas give an overview to frame things.
So, welcome everyone. It's great to be here. I hope you can see my screen, hear me all right. I'd like to start a bit by giving you a broad overview over how apps are actually positioned inside Magnolia, because it helps to somehow understand what is expected from an app inside the system. So, Magnolia's interface, as you know, if you look at the header, its header consists mainly of three distinct elements. And I'm going to start with the one on the right, actually, because it's probably, from an experience point, the one which should be on the very left. It's the one where you spend most time in after you've used the system for some time. It's the personal element inside Magnolia, the one that allows you to organize quick access to the things you work on mostly or currently. It's the favorites icon. The next one is the most dynamic element of all. It's Pulse. It's where your tasks are shown, which hook you up into the workflows you participate in with your coworkers. It's also where messages are shown that should be of importance to you, like problems, warnings, or mere info messages. Which then leaves us with the third one, which is kind of the core thing for today. It's the apps. And astonishingly, the apps are the most static element in that interface, in the sense that they are provisioned by others, so there's nothing you can change in there. It's the work, it's the tools that you use to do your daily work. So how do apps actually work? If you look at it from one perspective, you can say that you typically split up work into smaller tasks and then choose an app to solve a single task, and then piece the results together again. So for the programmers on you, they're kind of implementing a divide and conquer algorithm or metaphor on a UI level. So a great app, seen from that perspective, is one that adds a clear value for your users. It means that it adds a missing piece to the existing puzzle of apps. It doesn't duplicate what is already there. A great app also has a narrow focus. It tends to typically work on a single type of content only, let's say a contact or a page, or at least a set of related functions. So it's not overwhelmed, over-packaged with lots of stuff, but it's typically very, very narrowly focused in order to really work as building block. It has to play well with the other apps, which means that it should integrate well visually, even if it looks exactly as the other apps. And it should also integrate well from a functional perspective, meaning that its UI should not invent anything totally new that doesn't go together with how the other apps are used. Of course, apps have to be somehow easy to understand and use. I think that's one of the basic principles that hold true for any type of applications today. And if you kind of create an app that has these 4 points, then you can be sure that the building block is tiny enough that it works together well with other apps. That's even more going to be the case if we start in Magnolia to expose app functionality to other apps, which we plan to do, or even talk together apps to build streams of work. From another kind of perspective, maybe a more visual one, maybe a one you can more easily remember. Here's kind of a series of images that say the same thing. An app is a needed tool that works well and has a great usability, and which, if combined with the other tools in the product, provides for a great experience. Okay, so typically that means that there are a lot of questions that you have to answer when you design an app before you actually even start coding. And we'd like to help you build great apps, and that's why we've written a number of guidelines which we've styled after recipe cards. There used to be magazines in Switzerland and other countries as well, which contained recipe cards you could collect, and those had a very simple image at the front side and short instructions on the back side. And we kind of modeled these guidelines after these cards because we wanted to make sure that you didn't have to read a lot in order to understand them. So to give you, actually those are available online. They are part of our online documentation. There's about 12 there currently, and we are continually expanding them. So we would love to hear from you. Comment on them, suggest new ones. I'm currently working on one for that describes views more prominently. Here's a couple of examples that are also relevant for apps. When do I use which type of alert? We can use banners, alerts, or notification messages. Each of these type of alerts has its very own character, and it's important to know when to choose which one in order to not interrupt the user too much. There's another one for naming action bar elements, what type of naming we typically follow, how we spell titles. And similar one, that's the one with the alerts. When do we actually show what type of error and how prominent does it have to be in another card? These are actually cards that during this year's conference we handed out physically as part of the visitors collection that they got. It was kind of fun to do. Then there's another one, and this one brings us back to the very topic of today's webinar. It's what type of app you should actually build when you design your app. There's two big types. One is a content app and one is a custom app. Content apps, which are great for managing custom data sets, and custom apps, which are more if you want to more suited if you want to build your own UIs. And I'm actually going to hand over to Jan now, which shows you a lot more about these two different styles.
So, welcome from me as well to everybody, and thanks Andreas for handing over. When it comes to content apps, your typical content app might be Contacts. That's actually something you're seeing on the screen right now. That's one of the apps we are shipping with Magnolia as sort of a demo of what you can do. Another kinds of typical content apps would be news articles, maybe product sheets, maybe some cooking recipes, etc. Basically any kind of content which you might want to show in multiple pages on your website, but which doesn't belong into any single page. Any kind of content pool that you can think of. That's what the content app is about. In our experience, 9 out of 10 apps that people create with Magnolia are actually the content apps. Knowing that, we also tried to make sure that we aid you as much as possible when creating content apps. So when you need one, you can create it by configuration. You don't need any Java knowledge. You don't need to be a programmer. If you follow the design guidelines, if you look at the recipes at the cookbook which we provide inside of Magnolia documentation on our website, you should be able to create very good, compelling content apps which deliver to your users container for storing and representing any kind of information they might need. In Magnolia 5.3, we took it one step further and we sort of liberated content apps. Before, since Magnolia 5 until Magnolia 5.3, content apps always represented content that was stored in JCR repository. Seeing that people like the format, that people like the content apps, they understand the concept, it's very easy to translate it to the users. We've also seen that people start to pick up those apps and want to take them farther. They want to use apps to represent content, which is maybe in database, maybe in file system, maybe in some online resource. So we liberated the content apps in a way that we cleared out APIs and made it even easier to actually build apps that not necessarily store the content in the JCR, but if you already have such a content elsewhere, you can just use the UI, use this nice user interface to bring such a content to your users, to your editors, and they then can use that content when creating the website without actually even knowing that the content is elsewhere. So when you're writing those liberated content apps, there is, of course, some Java coding required. That's unfortunately the necessity in order to bring or to build the connector to connect to the external data set. Vaadin know-how, it's helpful there also if you want to have some special representation of the data apart from what we already provide. And if you want, or if you have already some Spring components or Spring services which actually work with those data, you can utilize the Blossom module to very easily bring those services into the app connector and use or build such apps and give them to your users in amazingly short time. Apart from the content apps, that 1/10 of the apps which people develop are so-called custom apps. Those apps can be anything. They deliver any kind of functionality. They do whatever you need to do. They represent some other services. In this example, which I'm just showing right now, such a custom app is actually bringing in the Swagger UI for testing REST services. So you can have app which tests REST services. You can also develop apps which will do other things, maybe export content in some standalone servers or in some other services. Maybe they will process something. They will allow you to do some graphical designing, graphical manipulation, or graphical object manipulation inside of Magnolia, etc. No matter what kind of app you are developing, there are certain steps which you need to take. Those steps are usually defining the module, writing a service to encapsulate the business logic in case of custom apps, then adding the app launcher entry, defining and implementing sub-apps, defining and implementing actions. As I was saying, for the content apps, you can do all of that by configuration. It doesn't have to be any Java coding. You can do it from within Magnolia UI, and I will show you later as well how to do it. When you are actually working with the custom apps, or when you are doing liberated content apps, when you want to bring in something extra, some extra look and feel, extra layout, etc., you would be always extending or building those apps on the base sub-app class. There, that class gives you all the flexibility. It basically gives you the canvas of the page, and you can do whatever you need, whichever way you need it. However, knowing or seeing many different patterns which people already used, we also try to aid you in creation of those apps as well. There are a number of custom layouts which we ship with Magnolia. Have a look at them, try them out. Most of the time when starting developing custom apps, small app layout, it's very good for you to start with. That allows you to build such a UI in pure Vaadin way. And it also makes sure that whatever UI you build over a small app layout will display very well on the desktop and on the tablets when somebody uses that app from the mobile. Another very important kind of sub-app which you might want to use is embedded page sub-app. That one allows you to show external content in an iframe inside of Magnolia Shell, and it's very useful for lightweight or very quick integration, especially when you are doing some kind of prototyping. So have a look at that one as well. And of course, as always, when working with Magnolia, Maven is your friend. So we have archetype which you can use to generate the modules, to generate the whole basic setup for creating an app, and I encourage you to use it when you're actually starting developing custom apps. Now to the interesting part, I'll be switching off the presentation and showing you some things. I said it before that when you are creating the custom or content app, you can everything configure in Magnolia. I've done it a number of times, and actually for those of you who want to see, here you see the full configuration of the contact apps. You see it's all in a repository, but you also see that there is a lots of boilerplate code which you don't necessarily want to code. From my experience, when you have to click all that through, even though you can do it through the UI, it takes about 2 hours to actually configure such an app, and you don't necessarily want to do it. We recognize this, and as I said, when delivering Magnolia 5, we tried to make sure that it is possible to configure the apps. Now we are taking it one step farther with the liberated content apps in Magnolia 5.3. And in the pipeline for Magnolia 5.4, we are actually trying to give you even better interface, even more aid how to create such apps. And just as a peek preview, what I will show you and what is already available for you is there is a simple script that looks like this, which allows you to actually generate such apps. At the beginning of the script, there is a small configuration section which allows you to set in the display name for your app, from which you can also derive the name of the type, name of the workspace, etc., all the things. So that's basically, if you want to be minimalistic when generating new apps, that's the only thing you need to configure. Apart from that, you can also change the app launcher entry, you can change the parent module for this item, etc. But the script will take care of everything. You don't need to think about which actions you need to configure, etc. There are good default values for you, and I'll just demonstrate that right now. So let's create new app. Let's say we are in the mood for something sweet, so we generate a pastry app. And I leave all the other values default. I don't change anything. I just run my script. In a few seconds, Magnolia tells me that my app was generated. So let's have a look at that app. Let me just quickly log out and log in. So I can see it in the app launcher. And here is my app, newly generated app. I didn't specify any custom icon, so I get the default one. I have the app here. Already I have some actions for creating a folders in case I want to categorize something. So say I will want to create some French. Oops, what did I do here wrong? French and some maybe Danish pastry. Okay, that's created here, and now I add an entry. You see the script already generated some basic dialogue for me, so maybe I add a croissant. Here I upload the image, which I have somewhere prepared here. I save my entry for the Danish pastry. Maybe I want to add just a Danish there, right? And again, I select the image. Not sure that's the right one, but let's see. Well, not really, but okay. Get the point. Now I see I created the entry in the wrong folder, so I can also show you that even drag and drop is configured correctly for the entries. You can also see that if I select the entry, I can see the preview immediately. I can publish, unpublish items, I can export, import them, I can delete, I can rename, edit the entries again. If I want, I can go into the dialog configuration, add their extra fields, or I could add them in the script upfront. So with that, I'm actually saving myself some hours of time when starting to build the content apps. And that would be actually all from me for now. And with that, I will hand over to Mika to actually show you something more you can do with the apps and with the connectors for the apps. Mika?
Hi, thanks, Jan. So we've seen JCR-based content apps so far with this great script time saver, really. And yeah, now we're gonna dive a little bit more into non-JCR content apps, those so-called liberated content apps. So you've probably seen that graph before. Basically, you can develop a content app and show content from an external data source in a content app. That means something either in through a REST API or in a MySQL database, whatever you want. So quick recap once again. So Jan told some part of it already. So we have these liberated content apps since Magnolia 5.3. From the technical perspective, some key terms are containers, content connectors, or item IDs. So there are several key concepts that are from both Vaadin and Magnolia. And well, we've heard some feedback from people who were seeking a little bit of guidance because it's not necessarily easy. But we mentioned these terms, we are used to them. And it's easier also if you're familiar with Vaadin, obviously, but yeah, basically some people wonder where should I start? So I'll try to answer that in this presentation today. Yeah, so I'll try to cover it more starting from Vaadin. So check how we would do that from if we were building a plain Vaadin application, and then we'll see what Magnolia adds on top of it and what is the additional work required to integrate this as a content app. And to show you bits of code and so on, I'm going to reuse the sample app I made for the conference back in June. So it's called Photo Scout, and it displays photos taken from Instagram over the REST API, and does a little bit of other stuff with stars and so on, but we're really going to focus just on fetching the content for today. Yeah, that's it. So that's demo time. Quick demo, not much to say. So well, basically, I run the app, and I can see photos from Instagram. By default, I use the hashtag mconf14. That was the hashtag for the Magnolia conference this year. So I can select photos that again have all the same features as JCR content apps have. I have the image preview. I can use actions. Well, here I suggest photo action. I don't want to do that now. I can change the settings. So instead of showing by tag, I could show by user, or I could change the tag and also show some pastries. And if I go back, then yeah, I have now a list of pastries. They all look delicious. I also have a list view that I could configure and basically fetch any kind of data which is exposed over Instagram's API. I could append it to a table in the Magnolia content app. So that's it for the demo. So from now on, I'd like to take a little step back and start thinking, okay, what if I was building such an app outside of Magnolia as a plain Vaadin app? What would I need? So at first we have our data source, a big fat data source, and we want to build just a very simple UI, a simple Vaadin application which just holds a table or tree table. And just we want to see the content from this data source in this table. So in Vaadin, what we typically need is a container. So, well, there are several existing containers that are shipped with Vaadin out of the box. So you may reuse one of these, or you may implement one of yours. It's up to you. And yeah, containers, they just gather well, they represent every single entry from the data source as items. This is part of the Vaadin data model. And yeah, so this is just the typical way how things go. So your container represents things from the data source, and the container is plugged into the table, or the tree table, to display the information. So that's it from Vaadin. Now, if we want to see what Magnolia has on top of it to use it as a content app, then first, let's change the context a little bit. So we see the Vaadin UI now is the content app. We have the workbench, but the workbench still holds a table. It's still a Vaadin table in there. So to populate it, we still use a Badin container. This part isn't changed. The flow from the data source up to the table in Magnolia Content App is still the same as in the plain Badin application. What Magnolia adds on top, and especially to integrate it much better with as a content app, is the content connector. It's actually a rather small part on top of the container, and we're gonna talk about it a bit later on. And well, from this content connector, you can actually then use it as well to connect other typical content app components with it and just integrate the whole picture together. So yeah, again, let's go back to Badin a little bit. So the picture on the background is taken from Badin, from the book of Badin. So it shows the data model that they have. So basically what interests us here is the container. So it's just their interface for collecting various items, various data items. As you can see in there, every item is identified by an item ID. Here it's written IID, but we generally call them item IDs. And so each item then has properties identified by property IDs and so on. So yeah, and also from the book of Badin, I took this picture here, which shows the bit of the class hierarchy from the Badin data package. And what interests us here is the content. So we have the container interface, and it's actually a very simple interface where you can just get an item or get which are the item IDs that are existing in my data source so far. And you can add sub-interfaces to it to reflect more of the structure of your data source. So whether your data source is hierarchical, you would implement container.hierarchical. Or if you want to display content in a lazy loading list, most likely you're going to need indexed sub-interface. So here's a few container implementation tips if you write a container and plan to use it in a Magnolia Content app. So, well, anyway, the first thing you should do is start by extending the abstract container from Badin. There's actually not much in there, but it already handles some kind of listening and notifying mechanism whenever the content in your data source changes, so you don't have to write that again. And the second tip here would be to focus on the read operations, because in Magnolia Content apps, they will perform only read operations over the container. They will not perform write operations over the container. Write operations, we typically handle them with actions, so yeah, just focus on read operations, leave the write operations unimplemented. And yeah, again, if you're not really familiar with those APIs or with how to write a Badin container, I highly encourage you to go to the book of Badin and read the whole chapter 8 about binding data to components, collecting items in containers. It's very essential. So let's take a quick look at the Instagram container that was used in the Photoscout example. So at first, I want to show it collapsed because I want to give you an overview, and so we can look at the regions, what is implemented in there and what is not. So at first, we notice that indeed the container extends the abstract container from Badin, and it implements the indexed container because I'm using the list view in Magnolia, so most likely you need the indexed container. So this part is the methods from the container interface, those read operations. There are not too many of them, as you can see. Below, we can see also write operations, and here as I said, I left them unimplemented, so I will throw the unsupported operation exception. And Magnolia Content Apps, they won't try to use these methods anyway, so that's safe to do anyway. And below we see the container indexed interface methods. And in there, yeah, we will see whether we want to check what is the next item ID, what is the previous one, just to deal with lists or paging for lazy loading, these kind of things, and that's handled by this interface. Again, a few write operations below here, and they are also left unimplemented. One more thing, we've seen also the refreshable interface is implemented here. It's actually an interface from us for Magnolia, because sometimes within the content apps we need to explicitly refresh the container. And in some plain Vaadin containers, it actually also exists, the refresh method, such as the SQL container. And well, in my case, I just use it to have just one method which encapsulates the calls to the REST API. It actually uses Instagram 4J as a wrapper library for it. And yeah, based on the settings, whether I use a hashtag or a username, I will perform different calls. So get recent media for the tag and so on. I will populate some kind of cache, which is just a map where I keep these items. While I'm mentioning this kind of cache, it's important that you think as well about your caching strategy. So in my case, I wanted to keep the calls to Instagram API with my OAuth credentials. I wanted to keep that under control. So I didn't want to call the API for each and every atomic operation. So that's why I'm building a cache in there, and I'm just holding a map in memory with the 30 most recent items for a specific hashtag or user. But if you're in a different setup and maybe you can afford to make calls for whichever atomic operation the container needs, then go for it. All right, let's move on. So while we're talking about containers, one of the methods in the container is get item IDs. So give me the list of all the item IDs that exist on this data source. And for this, we need to define what item ID we want to use and what is a good item ID. So a good item ID is the most simple unique representation for your content. Typically in Magnolia, to identify JCR items, we use workspace plus UUID. This way we can target one specific workspace, make sure that, well, this item ID is unique within Magnolia. But another example would be a photo ID in Flickr, or same thing in Instagram, it's just a plain string, or just the path on a simple file system. The tip here is also we should not just manipulate string, concatenate string to build such item IDs. We should use a dedicated POJO instead. That's perfectly valid to do. And I'm just going to show you that briefly with what we have in the case of JCR. So the JCR item ID, as you can see, is just such a simple POJO with UUID and workspace. And it also implements the equals method. This way you can actually compare or do some really simple operations without having to manipulate the strings and so on. So that's it for it. And there might be more challenging situations where you need more than strict uniqueness, or it depends how you want to represent your data. Say, for example, photos in a Flickr album, they have a unique photo ID, but they might belong to multiple albums. And you might want to display those photos in a tree where the first level is an album. And in there, if you use only the photo ID as item ID, then probably it's not going to look that good in the tree table. Maybe if you select one item under one hierarchy, then it's also going to select it in another location. So probably there you want to fine-tune it with a little bit more information. Fine. So we've covered some Vaadin topics up till now. So we had the container, we had the item ID. Now, what about the content connector? What does Magnolia add on top of it? So here I just updated the diagram a little bit. So you see my data source is Instagram, and I use it through Instagram 4J as kind of my service layer. So what is a content connector? It's very simple. It's just kind of a stateless object that helps mapping your own business objects to three main representations. So you should be able to map them to a unique item ID, as we've just seen. Then from this item ID, maybe get a Vaadin item out of it, and vice versa. From the item, get its item ID. And you also want to be able to translate it to a URL fragment. This is a string representation, should be more or less readable if it's possible. And it's actually used in the location fragment whenever you select an item in the table. I don't know what, maybe I can quickly go back here. But if I select something in my app, then we see the location fragment in the address bar gets updated, same thing for the status bar. So what you get from as benefit from implementing a content connector, then basically you can use actions and action availability to operate on one or multiple items. You can so the selection gets synchronized, and the image provider, for example, can be plugged to this. You can bookmark such selection, add favorites to go directly to your content, whether it's in a browser sub-app or detailed sub-app. And you get chooser capabilities, so you can open a choose dialog and integrate your external content with other apps. For example, you could have a choose dialog to pick an image and use it in a component. And then you can render this image in a template on the website. Let's take a brief look at the Instagram content connector. So here's the guy. So, well, first, if we look at the interface, it is indeed fairly simple. So just one-to-one conversion from an item ID. I can go to the URL fragment and vice versa. What is the default item ID? And I can get an item from an item ID. And so on. Yeah. Then the implementation, in my case, for the URL fragment, I took the most straightforward approach I could have, because my item ID is already a string. I use it as such. I don't do any conversion in there. And yeah, typically when I get an item out of my container, I set an item property ID to the media ID that I get from Instagram, and that's what I use as item ID. That's what you've seen. So let's move on. So I would like to talk a little bit about dependencies, about flavors, how you can relate the content connector to the container. Because so far we've seen that, okay, we can still populate our table with the flow here from the data source to the container to the tree table. But yeah, where does the content connector come into play? So the content connector is used fairly widely by other components. So it can be used by the image provider, or by the sub-app, or by the action executor, whatever component is essential actually in Magnolia Content Apps. And so you see, up till now we haven't really told whether the content connector should be bounced to the data source directly or to the container. And there's no good or bad answer to that. There are just various options, and they will depend on your project setup. First option would be to use the container in your content connector. So if you can share such container between your content views, then that's one option. That's actually what I do also in the example of the Photo Scout. Second option would be for those calls that need to get item by the content connector, you could also ask your service layer directly. Or even one third option could even be to implement the content connector on your container, because there is actually one overlapping method to get item, and you might want to expose the internals of the container so your content connector can do some more fine-grained behavior there. So that's it for the content connector. Now, why this arrow is blinking is, well, we know how to build a container, but we haven't seen how can I plug this container to the actual tree table in Magnolia. I mean, as a plain vanilla application, it's easy. We just call set container data source. But in Magnolia, how do we do? So that's what this slide is about, hooking the container. So at first, you will need to extend Magnolia's default content presenters. So we have 3 or 4 of them for list presenters, tree presenters. So you get a whole lot of stuff out of the box by extending them. And the only thing you have to do is actually to override the initialized container and either instantiate your own container, or actually I can show you as well. In my case, in the list presenter, this is my initialized container method. I just get the container from the content connector in my case. But you might, here you could do return new hierarchical container from directly one container from Vadin, or whatever you like. And finally, for these content presenters to be used, you need to configure them. So that's in the configuration below the browser workbench content views. Let's quickly check again, where is this? So now this is the configuration for the PhotoScout app. I have the workbench definition there and content views. So that's where these are configured. And in particular, what is interesting is the implementation class. So this class is the photo review list presenter. That's exactly the one I just showed you before here. So that's pretty much it. I hope I could give you a nice overview of how the pieces plug together, and that actually most of the container stuff is Vaadin, while the Magnolia layer on top is fairly thin. So yeah, feel free to ask questions if you want to dive deeper in some photo. If I overlooked anything, just let us know. Thank you.